The microphone is off.
Okay, so just making sure. You can hear me online, right?
I think so.
Okay. All right. So, well, thanks again for being here. And it's actually quite a great pleasure because I gave a seminar here about 20 years ago, a long time ago, when I was doing my PhD and was visiting some colleagues here. So, nice to be here again. The work that I want to show is really kind of an overview of the collaboration that I've had with a number of colleagues over the years, and some of the motivation for the seminar came in part through a conversation with Jesus, and he mentioned there is still quite a big disconnect between the surface modeling community and the hydrogeological modeling community, and I thought, well, let me take the chance to show a bit also of that side of the work. The emphasis I'll have here is going to be primarily on the estimation of dealing with predictive uncertainties in streamflow prediction. The context is really the modeling of the water cycle at the catchment scale. Obviously, hydrology can be done at a range of scales, from hill slope to continental. Most of the work that I do is at the catchment scale. I think many of the ideas apply at other scales, but really the context here is going to be the catchment. And a bit of background, just again to get everyone on the same page. I'm going to be really looking at the routing of precipitation to streamflow. There are other types of hydrological models that deal with other variables, but I'm really more in the streamflow space. And there are many, many different types of models: lumped, distributed, conceptual, physically based. Lots of debates in the literature about which model is best. I'm going to be sidestepping a lot of these debates. I'm going to be dealing with questions that I think apply to all the models, which is dealing with the predictive uncertainty. And of course, if you know all the debates between conceptual and physical models now, there's a new kid on the block, machine learning, and that is generating a lot of controversy of its own. And here I also like to make this distinction, which is perhaps a little bit artificial at times, between scientific and engineering hydrology. I think the distinction is not always there, but I think it's also does provide a bit of context. So really, when we're looking at scientific modeling context, we're looking at improving our process understanding, whereas in engineering hydrology, and I'm in fact based at an engineering department, we're looking at making some concrete predictions, perhaps in flood forecasting or longer-term predictions. These goals are not always aligned with each other. Sometimes we might choose methods depending on these objectives. But also, of course, in many other cases, they are aligned. We can, if we want to improve the predictions, generally speaking, we also would like to ensure we have a good process understanding. What's common amongst all of these issues is that these models are increasingly used in decision-making, in environmental management contexts. And in fact, some of the work that I do is with the Australian Bureau of Hydrology, which is very much interested in forecasting at a range of timescales, and I'll show you some results from there. Now, as I mentioned, despite this plethora of different types of models, we would like to have some common objectives. We would like to achieve credible predictions. There's also a lot of movement towards spatial predictions over large scales, and inevitably we have to recognize the uncertainties that we have in our systems. And this is some of the context of our collaboration with the Bureau of Hydrology in Australia. The Bureau is Australia's main government agency that deals with water across the continent, across the country. And they produce a number of different products, including streamflow forecasts at a range of timescales. Now, they do them at real time, up to months ahead, seasons ahead. The work that we do with them is really at that seasonal timescale. So looking at 1 to 3 months ahead, sometimes about a week ahead also. And we've been collaborating with them for about 10 years or so. And they have this very modest goal to provide high-quality monthly streamflow forecasts Australia-wide. So these are the various locations of the catchments that they're interested in, and you will obviously recognize how everyone in Australia lives primarily on the coast. So that's some of the practical motivation for our work. Where do these models fit in practice? In a lot of the Bureau products, they use conceptual models, essentially a collection of buckets, usually 2 or 3. This is the GR4J conceptual model, one of many, of course, and these kinds of models are used as part of the prediction and decision support systems. They are used to plan some designs of depths of storage volumes, also both in the flood mitigation, but also for water storage, for irrigation purposes, for drinking purposes. And the forecasts that the Bureau issues are used by managers of dam operators, when to release water, when to keep the water in. They're also used in allocation of various industrial, urban and environmental uses. So these models are increasingly used in these practical contexts. And when we look at how well they perform, inevitably we're going to see there is a mismatch between what the model tells us and what happens in reality. And so this leads us to this very thorny question of dealing with uncertainties in these model predictions. And one of the key points that I want to make is that we're going to be talking about probabilistic methods of describing this uncertainty. Probability theory is not the only way to describe uncertainties. There are other paradigms, but the one that I'm focusing on here will be the probability theory. And you can already see that if you want to have an informed decision, having a sense of the uncertainty in your prediction is going to be obviously much more helpful than just having a point prediction. Okay, so I have a fairly ambitious outline for the talk. I'd like to have it fairly informal, so I enjoy questions and debates. So I'll see how we go through these things, but really the core is going to be on probabilistic prediction, and I want to talk a bit about aggregated approaches, which I think are quite suitable for practical applications, see how far we can take them with this residual error approach. This is a bit more ambitious in a scientific sense, trying to understand where the uncertainty is coming from primarily. So we have to decompose the uncertainty into the different components. And time permitting, I'd like to also talk a bit about flexible models. Perhaps in this audience might be a bit controversial, but I like that. Should we use fixed or flexible models? Some of the context here will be with lump models, but also, again, time allowing, we'll talk about spatial applications. Okay, so a couple of things that I just want to put up front in terms of terminology. We're looking at predictions over a range of timescales and lead times from real time to seasonal. But from the point of view of the quality of the predictions, there are a few criteria that we would like to meet. And one of the obvious ones is the precision of the prediction. A prediction with let's say 10% uncertainty is generally going to be more useful than a prediction with plus or minus 50% errors. So here we're looking at essentially the magnitude of uncertainty. And if we want to reduce or improve the precision, we will need to improve our, generally speaking, we will need to improve our representation of the catchment processes and extract most of the information from the data that we have when we set up the model. That's something that I think is fairly apparent, but the second criterion is one that perhaps is a bit less widely known, is the concept of reliability or statistical reliability. And reliability can mean many different things to different people. In statistics, in probabilistic prediction, we're talking about the correspondence between what the uncertainty estimate that comes from our method and the actual errors that take place in reality. So, for example, if we just say that our prediction has plus or minus 10% errors, but in reality, the errors are over and over 50%, and then we have a problem. We have a misleading, over-optimistic prediction. Okay, so when we report on uncertainty, generally speaking, we would like an uncertainty to correspond to the actual errors. And that's, in this context, is what we refer to as the reliability of the prediction. And the third criterion is not really a statistical criterion or even perhaps a scientific criterion, but it's a practical engineering criterion. A lot of these systems are used in practice. They're not just used for one catchment. The Bureau wants to use these things, these methods, across hundreds or thousands of catchments, so they have to be practical, they have to be efficient in a computational sense. And they also have to integrate into the systems that the Bureau already has. Okay, so I think that provides a bit of background, and I'll just have a few slides here that I guess illustrate and remind us about the challenges of dealing with uncertainty. Here is the outline of the eastern coast of Australia, and you can see the crosses of the rain gauges. Here is the ocean, that's the land. And you can see that there's a fairly dense coverage. I think this is the Sydney metropolitan area. And if you look at this particular catchment, the Bigara catchment, which is about 1,200 square kilometers, so kind of average size, it's an ungauged catchment, there are no rainfall gauges there. And this color image is the rainfall radar estimate. And what's, I think, quite interesting is how, on that particular date, we had a storm that pretty much went in between the rain gauges, rain and our catchment. So if we are relying on estimates from the rain gauges to see what happens at our catchment, we're going to have a big problem. So this isn't to say that rain gauges are useless or radar is better, but just to show that there are, even in Australia, as well as in Australia, there are many locations that are sparsely gauged. And so dealing with these rainfall uncertainties is a big practical question. Also, representing the diversity of streamflow generation processes is a challenge. We might have environments that are humid with constant flows. We might have some mountainous environments, maybe not so much in Australia, but say in New Zealand, where this picture comes from. In Australia, we're dealing a lot with ephemeral conditions and drying out in general. So again, can we have models that can accommodate all of these conditions? I would say that's still a fairly open question. One comment that I also want to make here, again, to provide some context, is that when we're working with rainfall runoff models, we have multiple distinct sources of error. And when we look at the top box, we're sitting here, what happens in our real system. We have the real rainfall event, which, let's say, precipitates over our catchment with all of its heterogeneity, both on the surface and in the subsurface, and then the catchment generates some stream flow. When we move to our model imaginary world, we have errors and uncertainties coming in at every step of the way. We have uncertainties in our rainfall due to the sparse sampling of the rainfall fields. When we measure the stream flow, in many cases we stick a ruler in the river and see how deep the flow is and convert that to a flow rate. And this is really another elephant in the room, the model structural errors. So when we represent a complex system with a collection of much simpler mathematical elements, I think I don't have to say much about the approximations inherent there. And so the question is, do we deal with all of these errors at once? Do we try to disaggregate them? Turns out that both approaches are viable. In some cases, it might be beneficial or advantageous to deal with all of the errors at the same time. In other cases, we might want to distinguish the different sources of error. Okay, and so that's what I want to talk a bit about next. So when we talk about the residual error approach, and again here I just following Jesus' recommendation, I want to start at a fairly basic level. How do we construct a probabilistic prediction using residual errors? Well, one way to do that is start with our deterministic model, our deterministic hydrological model. For example, this might be the stream flow over time. Here I'm plotting as a curve, but generally it might be a time series. And then we're going to assume what is called an error model, or a residual error model, which essentially is going to be describing the uncertainty around the prediction of this model. So in this particular case, I've made a very, very simple assumption, which is that this uncertainty is constant, has a constant variance, and so then our error bands are going to be also constant width. A couple of points here. In general, when we are estimating the model parameters, statistical estimation using likelihood functions will say that we want to use this error model when we calibrate the model parameters. So in other words, if we think of the observations being somewhere here, the model parameters for which these bands accommodate the predictions, well, are going to have a high likelihood, the model parameters for which the predictions are far away from. Okay, so the error model specification will impact on the parameter values. And of course, also, but obviously, it's going to impact on our predictions. So if these bands are very wide, we're going to have very vague predictions. If these bands are narrow, we're going to have very precise predictions. But of course, it's going to depend where our observations are. Okay, so quite an important aspect of probabilistic modeling, particularly using these residual error approaches. And of course, the assumption of constant variance is convenient for illustration purposes, but in reality, we're going to be using something that reflects the fact that the errors are not constant variance. Generally speaking, we will have high errors in larger flows, and so we might, for example, make the error variance a function of time in some way. You can see that this can lead to very different probabilistic predictions. Here we have, I would say, unrealistically wide uncertainty in the low flows, and we're underestimating uncertainty in the high flows. And here, actually, a little bit more balanced. Okay, so again, just a bit of background to see where we're going. And what I want to highlight here is that in this case, our residuals, which attempt to explain the difference between the observed data and the simulated stream flow, they try to accommodate all of the sources of error. So the errors in the rainfall, errors to do with the model structure, and also the errors in the observed streamflow measurements. And that's why we call it an aggregated approach. We are not trying to distinguish where the errors are exactly coming from. And there are a few features that we want to represent in the errors. This concept of heteroscedasticity, Greek word for changes in the variance. So generally speaking, error variance is larger in the larger flows. You can see that, well, it's not here, but maybe here. And also the concept of persistence in the errors. The error is not independent from time step to time step. If our model has a large error at one time step, generally speaking, that error is going to propagate in time, and we're going to have a series of fairly large errors. And we really would like to kind of represent both of these features so that our description of uncertainty is, let's say, agreeing with reality. And one implementation of this residual error approach is the so-called post-processor implementation. So if you look at statistical estimation theory, you might see what is called joint estimation, where you estimate the hydrology and the uncertainty parameters at the same time. Generally, we find that in practice, doing things in two steps is more robust and also a bit more flexible. So the two stages here are shown on this slide. In the first stage, we calibrate the hydrological model parameters using a potentially relatively simple objective function without trying to put in the full error model. And once we have that done, this can be done, let's say, with parameter optimization, least squares type with some transformations potentially. And then the second stage is where the residual errors come in. Our hydrological model predictions are fixed, and we are really just estimating uncertainty around that model. And that step is quite easy when it's done in this framework, because the residuals can be calculated and they're fixed. So if you're doing everything at the same time, then the residuals will vary. Whereas if you do the hydrology first, then the residuals can be calculated and you're just fitting the probability distribution to them. And that, I think, is quite a convenient approach in practice. And what's also interesting is that it tends to be also a bit more robust, as we discovered about 10 years ago. Another interesting question is the choice of the parameter of the streamflow transformation. So if we just assume that the errors are Gaussian, we have this predicted distribution at one time step. So this is to say the stream flow and the probability of that stream flow. This is just a Gaussian. In reality, this is not a very good approach. It's generally speaking preferable to use stream flow transformations, for example, the logarithmic transformation. And so then we are operating not in the stream flow space, but in the log stream flow space. And then we can assume the errors are, say, Gaussian in that transform space. This is a very common transformation, but again, in practice, there are other choices. The Box-Cox transformation, which is shown here, is it's a more general transformation. It has a parameter, lambda, and the nice thing about it is that if you set lambda to 1, you get no transformation. If you set lambda to 0, you get a log transformation in the limit, and you can also pick lambda, say 0.5, which case you'll have this square root transformation. So you kind of control the strength of the transformation. So it's quite a convenient approach. And you can also put a few more bells and whistles. You can put in some offsets to avoid dealing with zero flows and so forth. So with these transformations, we can essentially vary the shape of the predicted distribution. For example, we can introduce skew. We can introduce also, generally speaking, higher variance in higher flows. So generally speaking, there is an acceptance that these transformations are beneficial. And our question was, well, which transformation is actually the most useful for us? And this was one of the requests from the Bureau of Hydrology, because they wanted to employ this in their systems. And so we did a fairly large, at the time, case study where we looked at something like 23 catchments in the US and Australia. We looked at the cross-validation approach to estimate the performance, and we looked at the 3 performance metrics: reliability, precision, and also the bias. So I just want to show you some of the results from that work. A bit of a reminder about our criteria for performance criteria. So we already talked about precision and reliability, and here are just some illustrations. Here is an example of a prediction that is reliable because it captures the correct proportion of the observations, let's say in the 90% limits, and it's also quite precise because it follows the data. Here is an example of a predicted distribution which is reliable but imprecise. So this is actually very reliable. Again, the correct fraction of the observations are in the right probability limits, but already intuitively we can see that it's not a very useful prediction because it's very imprecise, very vague. If you want to make some decisions, clearly you prefer this distribution to this distribution. Okay, but you can also have other deficiencies. You can be precise, so you can have a very narrow width in our uncertainty limits, but unreliable because we're missing pretty much all of the data. So this is basically being overconfident. And you can also have biases and various other problems. And so for each of these criteria, reliability, precision, and bias, we can define a quantitative metric, and then we can compare different transformations, different residual error models based on these criteria. And here is a bit of a summary of them. There is quite a lot of results, but I just want to highlight a few interesting ones. This is maybe a fairly obvious result, but when you use standard least squares, which doesn't try to transform the data in any way, then we generally underestimate uncertainty in the high flows, overestimate it in the low flows. So we have this lack of balance in our results. When we use the logarithmic transformation, that provides a better balance. So when all of a sudden we're now capturing the observations in the high flows, and our low flows are also have actually an improved precision. And if you look at the performance metrics, here low is better. You can see there's a big improvement in the reliability because we're capturing that larger variance in the larger flows. There's also an improvement in the precision, and the bias, I would say there's some small improvement there. Okay, that's probably not hugely surprising, but it's nice to see it hold up in pretty much all of the catchments. But that was, they were perennial catchments, where you always have some flow. In ephemeral catchments, where the flow often goes to zero, the logarithmic transform often runs into problems. You can see these explosions in the width of the limits. And here is where the Bob-Scott transformation comes in, because we can pick that transformation strength parameter to be not as strong as the logarithmic, but still have some transformation there. And so when we sort of back off a little bit, we find that our predictive limits again have a much better quality. Again, in our high flows, we have a reasonably good capture of the observed data, and in the low flows, we also are doing quite well. You can see here, we got rid of the biases. Reliability is the same, because again, these prediction limits are, interestingly enough, reliable, they're just very imprecise again. Okay, and if you're interested in the reasons for why this happens, essentially it's to do with how sensitive the logarithm function is near zero. And so when you have ephemeral catchments with lots of zeros or close to zero flows, then this becomes quite sensitive and not very robust. When we back off a little bit, have a weaker transformation, that problem disappears, which is, I think, quite an interesting finding. So you think that that's everything there is to it, but we also found quite an interesting result that we can't always get everything that we want. Ideally, we would like good reliability, good precision, a little bias, but generally speaking, the different error models are going to have different characteristics. For example, in perennial catchments, the logarithmic transformation has excellent reliability, but actually is a bit worse than others in terms of the bias. Okay, and same with the precision. And so there is a trade-off there, and we looked at, let's say, these are actually what we refer to as the Pareto optimal schemes. We looked at a few others, but they were worse in every respect, so we kind of narrowed down the range to these options. In ephemeral catchments, we also see the same picture, except that the logarithmic transformation is not suitable, so we're just down to the BCO2, BCO5. So these are the Bob-Scott transformations with the transformation parameter lambda of 0.2 and 0.5. The 0.5 is the square root transformation, so you can think of it that way. Okay, so you can already see there are some choices to make. It's difficult to achieve good performance in every single characteristic. Now, how does that then work in practice? So remember that this was part of our work with the Bureau, and they don't want to do this in one catchment, they want to do this in many, many catchments. And this was a comparison between let's say, the benchmark scheme that the Bureau was using before we started working with them, or in fact, in the early stages of that work. And this is obviously the map of Australia. The dots are the locations of the catchments where the predictions are necessary. These are monthly forecasts, and the color codes indicate essentially the performance of that system at that catchment. Essentially, here we're looking at the number of months where the predictions at the monthly scale are better than the climatology, so the marginal distribution of streamflow. So basically, green are catchments where the system is doing well, red is where the system is doing worse than the climatology. So you're better off just looking at the record that already gives you better, the historical record already gives you better performance in the model. So red stuff is not good. And after we've implemented those recommendations from that work, you can see a big improvement that we're obviously very happy with. All of a sudden, we went from just 20% of the sites with good predictive ability to over 80%. So you can see big improvement here, green. Not everywhere, there are still some places where things don't work well. And again, I think that's life. We're looking at what exactly is happening there, and perhaps there are some further improvements that can be made. If you're interested in more details, again, we had this published a few years ago, but I think it's been a good example of the collaboration between the research team and the government agency. Here we had to make a lot of pragmatic choices because we can't just focus on one catchment for 5 years. It had to be a system that can be rolled out pretty much everywhere in Australia. Okay.
One question, Dimitri.
Yeah.
Yeah, in this comparison, the models were the same. You only changed the residual error during the calibration, or
That's
what
correct.
is exactly before and after?
Yeah, this is before, before, let's say, the implementation of the recommended residual error model, and this is after, and everything here is the same except for the residual error model. So this is forecast, so the forecast rainfall is the same, the hydrological rainfall-runoff model is the same, observed data is the same, cross-validation is the same, everything is the same, essentially.
And the model parameters are also the same.
Good question. I have to think quickly about that. They might be the same. This is a while ago. I think at this stage we were doing the post-processor approach, so I would say parameters are probably also the same, but I might need to double check that for you. Okay. But in any case, the only difference would be in the calibration of the parameters. If they were different, it would have been due to the streamflow transformation. So if you remember, it impacts both the parameters and the predictions. But I'll need to double check that to be 100% sure. I just don't want to be overconfident. Does that make sense, Jesus? Okay.
Yeah, it makes sense, but there is one of the things that I want to discuss later that is it was related to this, so that's why I wanted to find
look
out.
forward to that. So please collect your questions and then we'll find out. So that was a while ago, a few years back, and one of the questions we had is really how far we can take this approach of the residual errors. And one of the questions that was really being asked of us is, can we produce a forecasting system which performs pretty well at a range of lead times and time scales? So typically, to give you a bit of a background, if you look at the Bureau, they were interested in doing prediction, let's say, at the weekly lead times, or monthly lead times, or seasonal lead times. They had a different system for each of those lead times. So different algorithms, potentially, still have different parameter values, everything was different, and so you had, let's say, 3 different systems for 3 different lead times. And that's okay, but it's a bit inconvenient, because it's not seamless in the sense that if you change on the time scale, all of a sudden you'll have different algorithm, there are going to be some discontinuities in how they match up. It's also, it's like operationally less convenient, you just have to maintain a larger system, a collection of methods. And so the question we asked there was, can we build a single system that can achieve or perform well over a wider range of lead times and time scales? So lead times is how far ahead you forecast. Time scale here, I'm referring to the aggregation time scale. So if you're looking at, say, daily flows or monthly flows. So at least two different dimensions. And the answer was, to our, let's say, partial surprise, that yes, but we have to take care of a few more things. So far I talked about primarily the heteroscedasticity, so the transformations to account for larger errors and larger flows. I didn't talk about persistence or correlation, but that was already built in. But 3 extra components appeared to be necessary. People wanted to make more improvement. The first one, I'll just want to start with seasonality. The model tended to have different errors in different seasons. And so we introduced some extra parameterization there. There were some dynamic biases. I never quite liked the name, but we couldn't find a better one. But basically, instead of just having an AR model or a regressive model, we also put in some moving average components there. So kind of just different structure and persistence there. And finally, we found that even after transformation, the errors were not Gaussian, they generally had fatter tails, which is not very surprising. Generally speaking, the probability of outliers in the model errors is pretty high, higher than for the standard Gaussian. And so having a mixture of Gaussian models gave us that fatter tails in our predictions, which is was proven more realistic. And this is just some selected results. It's not really viable to go into all of the details, but we're looking here at the quality for different lead times. let's say from one day, because remember we're working with the daily model, and then we're looking at predicting from 1 day ahead to 28 days ahead. And there is an updating also of the error model. And you can see how the baseline, here is the performance curve there. The new model, which we call Mother, Multi-Temporal Hydrological Residual Error Model, is this blue line. The reliability metric is lower is better, so 0 is the best. And you can see how, perhaps a bit counterintuitively, but at short lead times, we're not very reliable. In fact, I can tell you it's because we were overconfident. The baseline model is overconfident. Okay. Whereas with incorporation of these three extra boxes, we now have quite consistent performance. So in terms of reliability, our predictions at 1 day have the same reliability as a month ahead. Not the same precision, but the same reliability. And this is just one of the different stratifications that we looked at. We also looked at a few others. If you're interested, I would probably suggest that you look at the papers or talk to me afterwards. But this is really an example of taking this further, building in more structure into the error model, and you can see that pays off, I would say, quite nicely. The other question that we asked is, well, can we actually go in a simpler direction? Do we need to recalibrate or reinfer the model parameters? Okay, and the motivation for that question is that in many cases, practitioners or researchers, they're not interested in the research and uncertainty. They have their own research interests. They just would like to account for the uncertainty. And so in those cases, very often, these modelers will have already a model that's set up in a way that they're happy with. And to say, well, now you have to recalibrate everything, doing a lot of everything from scratch, is not necessarily very practical. And that's, again, just the realities of life and engineering. And so the question is, if you already have a model that's set up and you're happy with it, can you just apply a model to it? That's quite an interesting question, and we weren't sure exactly what to expect. But it turns out that with some care, it's in fact possible, but again, within some restrictions. So again, here I just want to give a bit of a flavor, and I can direct you to the publication, but one of the challenges is that if you have essentially different transformations when you calibrate the model parameters and when you estimate the model, which is what happens in this sort of context, you will often have some artifacts in your residual errors. So this was a very typical one, essentially a bias in the model that depended on the magnitude of the streamflow. A little bit unusual, but this is because it was an unusual combination. We were calibrating a model without transformations and then estimating the uncertainty in the transform space. And again, there are some mathematics behind it that I think potentially explain this, but empirically, this was a fairly common finding of, I think, about 30 or 40 catchments. And if you don't account for this extra, let's say, structure, then when you do this residual error model on an already calibrated model, you have a fairly visible deterioration in the performance. So this is, let's say, a benchmark when everything is done consistently, using the methods that we discussed until now. And if you just then come in and switch the model, let's say to the box-Cox transformation model, then all of a sudden, because of this trend, we had an explosion, or let's say an undesirable increase in the width of the prediction limits. And this wasn't really satisfactory, but once we've enhanced the error model to say our mean is not just 0, but actually allows for this trend, and the parameters in the trend are estimated in, let's say, online when you do it, then we call this the enhanced scheme, and we get back predictions that are of more or less the same quality as when you have a consistent calibration and uncertainty estimation. So again, I'm skipping over some details here to give you a bit of a flavor, but I think that's a very interesting result. It just means that you don't have to redo everything from scratch, at least not every time. in some cases, or in many cases, you can take a model, look at the residual errors, and you might still be able to use pretty much the same models that we had before for those errors, which I think is an interesting result. So I'm not sure how I'm going time-wise. Let me just see. I know I'm covering quite a lot of ground. So probably I'll do one more probability topic and then probably call it the day on that. But here I just want to show kind of an interesting result that these schemes are pretty simple fundamentally. We're using a logarithmic transform. At the more complex end, we can have seasonality and things like that. But generally, we already have pretty good predictions with models that are simple in quotes, but not too simple. So the too simple is when you have no transformation. That doesn't work very well. In general, we found, I would say, a remarkable robustness of these error models with a lambda of 0.2 to 0.5. I think it generally reflects some kind of power law scaling in the errors of these models. And I think that those exponents seem to be remarkably general, interestingly. Now, but this was, I would say, operational context, where we wanted to get predictions, and we wanted to get them in a fairly fast and uncomplicated way. There is another dimension to probability analysis, where you actually look at the different sources of error in more detail. And I just want to finish with those. Okay, so here we come back to this picture, and we'll look at what happens at each of these, let's say, components of our system. And Bayesian theory, again, huge topic in its own right. I know that it's also used in groundwater. A bit of a background here, we are representing knowledge using probability distributions. And let's say if the distribution is flat, it represents vague knowledge. Typically, our prior knowledge is vague. And then the data is hopefully telling us something about these parameters, which gives us more precise estimates. The equation itself, probably one of the simplest equations you will ever see, just a couple of variables in different combinations. Of course, the challenge is what do you put into each of these terms? What do you put in the prior? What do you put in the likelihood? Not really viable for me to discuss everything now. I just want to show you what is possible in some situations. And again, we can discuss later if someone is interested in the detail. But here we're looking at attributing or decomposing the uncertainty, total uncertainty into the constitutive sources. So if we just look at the figure on the left, we have the hydrograph and the gray bounds. You can sort of see them here. The gray ones are the total 90% predictive interval. So everything, all uncertainty is there, 90%. The red subset here is our estimated contribution of structural errors in the model. Okay? So to make this a bit of a contrast, here is the same decomposition, but this time the partial contribution of the rainfall uncertainty. So remember, we have rainfall as an input in our model. So if you have rainfall uncertainty, it's going to propagate into streamflow uncertainty. And this is our estimate for this particular catchment. How much of the total uncertainty in the streamflow was due to the uncertainty in the rainfall? So kind of a decomposition. Now, that's a much harder question, not an easy one. Ironically, we did that before working with the simpler techniques, which probably wasn't the smartest, but it happened. And the idea here was that we were using the prior terms in Bayes' equation to take advantage of offline data uncertainty models. What does that mean? This is a schematic of our, let's say, modeling system. We have our model, let's say rainfall-runoff model. And as you recall, that there are errors coming in for the inputs, for the outputs, and also there is error in the model structure. And so then we wanted to build an error model, not just in the streamflow space, but we also wanted to build one for the rainfall data. Essentially, think of it again as some distribution around the observed rainfall. And for model structure, we used time-varying parameters. So our representation of structural error was to allow the model parameters to vary storm by storm, as it was. much harder question, and we had to use more data to achieve this. In fact, we used conditional simulation of rainfall fields to estimate the sampling error at a particular rain gauge. Here, that was for the rainfall, so it was not quite rigging, but conditional simulation. For the streamflow errors, we looked at the rating curves and the underlying data, so again, we spent a bit of time there. This was a bit of a dark horse for us. We just used those time-varying parameters. Probably the hardest one to deal with, I would say. But anyway, basically, if you want to do this sort of decomposition, you have to provide a lot of extra information. Because essentially you have a decomposition problem. You essentially have A plus B plus C is a known quantity, and you're trying to estimate A, B, and C separately. And so this really requires prior knowledge to come in. If you're prepared to invest that effort, I think it's a very interesting research question. And
Assuming they are independent.
sorry?
Assuming that the three sources of error are independent, which I don't think they are ever.
Yeah, so we can, I'm not sure I quite caught your question, Jesus, but we can maybe come back to it in a second. And this was an application of a similar decomposition approach, but looking at, this was an agricultural catchment and the contribution of irrigation schedule uncertainty on the stream flow. It was part of another project, and I just want to show you here that these ideas are applicable not just with rainfall, but also, for example, with irrigation scheduling. So I think that's probably enough. I think I didn't get to talk about flexible models, but I think that can wait for another occasion. I think probably uncertainty quantification is something that's probably most interesting. Really, this contrast between simple approaches which work in, let's say, in a relatively simple way of many catchments. I would say for operational work, the box-Cox transformation is a good choice. If you're prepared to invest the effort in collecting a lot of extra data and setting up much more complex inference schemes, then you can try to focus on individual sources of uncertainty. Lots of interesting work. I didn't really go into everything there, but I hope that it provided a bit of an overview for you to see what's happening in that space. Okay, so I think I'm happy to stop at this point. So thanks again for being here.
Okay. Let's first have some, I don't know, questions from the...
Very basic question.
Yeah.
Thanks for the nice presentation. So what you say that if you operate the transformation and then you do the residual error model but with transform data, right?
Yes.
So you get better results.
Yeah, it's better description of uncertainty.
Better description than
Yeah.
And then, but so here you say, for example, that lambda must be between 0.2 and 0.5.
I would say.
How do you define the value of lambda?
Well, right, so let me come back to that.
The best one, I mean.
The best one.
Why is not one?
How do we find it? Why do we say that this is the best value?
Yeah.
Right, so that was, so firstly, just to, again, make sure everyone is on the same page, lambda is this parameter in the transformation, controls the strength of the transform, and we looked at a range of options, a range of values of lambda. So we had 8 different residual error models. We looked at lambda of 1, which is no transform, 0.2, 0.5, 0, and -1. -1 is the inverse transformation. And then we looked at the performance metrics. So when we do the prediction, we quantify the reliability, we quantify the precision, quantify the bias, and then we can look at which of these error models gave us the best performance metrics. And that was the Pareto, this trade-off graph. So out of those 8 models, we found that these 3 were, we call Pareto optimal, because the other ones were worse in every metric, whereas for these 3, they were non-dominant, non-dominated. So for the log, you cannot beat the log in terms of reliability from that choice of methods, but you can beat it in terms of the bias and the precision. Same for that every other scheme. So there was basically no single scheme that did that best according to all the metrics. And so we found that these three schemes were perennial optimal in that respect. In perennial catchments. In ephemerals, we found the log wasn't so good, so then PCO2, PCO5. And then we made a bit, kind of a pragmatic decision, well, you know, you don't want to be, our recommendation, we wanted to make it general, so we just said, well, forget about the log, just use the 02 or 5 range. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
But the key
No,
one
but
is-
along this line, no, I want more.
Okay.
Did you explore the possibility of using a streamflow dependent lambda?
Yeah, there was, yes, there was, before we even got there, we tried also estimating lambda itself, because lambda is a parameter, so you can estimate it. Here it was fixed a priori, but it can also be estimated, just like you estimate any model parameter. The problem we found with estimating lambda was that, generally speaking, everything became dominated by the low flows. Because most flows are low, then these low flows were really, let's say, pulling lambda towards negative values. And those values were good for low flows, but very poor for high flows. So then the question really arises, the one that you suggested, Jesus, which is to make lambda flow dependent. We haven't really gone that. We did have a PhD student who was looking at that, and we got some results there, but let's say they're still in the experimental stage at this point. But good question, you know, can you make the flow dependent? Generally, you'll have the same trade-off as with making the model more complex. You might potentially run into some identifiability problems. At a minimum, you have to then decide how you want to make it flow dependent, and we haven't quite got all the answers there yet. But sure, if you wanted to make this model more complex, making lambda flow dependent is one option. Does that make sense?
I want to make it, no, my reading is the opposite. My reading is to make it simpler.
Make it simpler? Well, what do you
Yes.
mean?
Well, what I mean is, if at the top 5% flow rate, I use lambda 0.2. Excuse me, 0.5. Well, I'm not sure now. Anyway, I use a lambda for the top 5% and another lambda for the lower.
That's fine. And
Yes.
yeah, I didn't present that work because it's basically still going on. That is generally beneficial. I mean, the answer is yes, but generally, I don't like to present things that haven't been finished. Probably should have mentioned it as kind of future work or development work. You still have some choices of where you pull the stratification. Where do you say, how do you define a high flow, for example? And you also have a few other logistic issues there. You're going to have potentially discontinuity in your predictions as you switch the values of lambda, if you have an abrupt switch. So I think the idea is very good. So yeah, I think it's nice to see someone kind of having a similar impression. But like everything in research, a few other niggling issues have to be also resolved. But yes, I think making lambda flow dependent in some way is an option. I would still say that it's more complex than having a single lambda. So then, yes, if you're prepared to deal with extra complexity, I think it might be a good choice.
Just, let's say, a related question from a bit more theoretical rather than practical perspective. So, as you mentioned quickly, the fact that when you do this transform, you get better estimates, kind of hints that there's some power law structure to here, at least in some value ranges.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's in itself not too surprising, right? Because we see this all the time for statistical reasons, for central material.
Yeah.
But the fact that you have this pretty narrow range where you see that basically you're always optimal is more surprising to me anyway, that the power law has a given range. So my question is, do you have any kind of, even if it's a loose sort of idea, physical idea on why here should be power law and there should be in this range, or is this totally?
It's an empirical finding here, but as you've made, a good point that it does connect to the existence of power law scalings in nature in general. Why is it specifically 0.2? Honestly, I couldn't answer that very well. I would say that somehow it's, the log zero is a particularly strong scaling. It's just some kind of intermediate scaling, I guess, between those extremes.
So you're saying maybe there's a bigger range, but just having something fixed in the middle does a better job of capturing.
I think that's a good. Certainly if you start varying, like let's say 0.25, 0.3, you may well find something better for various particular situations. But that's again, not necessarily a very convenient. Let's say that's not a practical recommendation that's easy to implement in practice then, because we kind of come back to having a lot of choices to make. So I think there's a compromise. Ultimately, you're right, there's a compromise values that seem to do pretty well. I also should point out, and my answer to Jesus was alluded to indirectly a little bit, is that it probably also reflects the magnitude of the typical magnitude of the flows that we've been interested in. Because for the low flows, actually, it tries to go below zero, so it tries to have some kind of close to, not quite inverse, but let's say minus 0.1 or so, and that does well for low flows, but terrible for high flows, as you can imagine.
And from a practical perspective, I'm not sure that this is very interesting, like you said.
Yeah.
Can you do it in person?
Yeah.
It's just more from a curiosity.
No, but it's a good question. And actually, Christina, again, didn't talk about some of her work, but she's looking at other contexts, other timescales, and so we will see what happens and say the hourly timescale. But this was daily, so again, that's sort of future work. But again, I don't want to talk about things I'm not really confident in. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know. Any other question, or Jesus who wants to add something?
Yeah.
No, I have many questions. I love this presentation. Congratulations.
That's nice to hear.
I have several levels of questions. I'm not sure. One is the thing I disagree. Let's start with the disagreements. One thing I emphasize a lot for calibration, for model calibration, is to have a proper error structure. And for instance, I have found that you mentioned it in passing, but then I was left under the impression that you ignore it in the future, that using an autoregressive error structure is very important. Well, I no longer say autoregressive because no one knows what autoregressive means, but so what I say nowadays is to minimize the sum of square errors and to minimize the errors in the slopes, in the change in time over time, which is same as using autoregressive, but you don't have to use the word autoregressive. And in my experience for groundwater, that makes a big difference. So I was surprised when you said, well, no, we do it separately, the error and the error, because it doesn't matter. So
No, I didn't say it doesn't matter. I said there was some, let's say, there is some empirical evidence that in some cases you will have a pretty strong interaction between let's say some of the hydrological parameters and the autoregressive coefficient. And so and we haven't really found a way around it for that particular type of model we want to use. And again, I have an entire separate presentation just about that topic because it was a paper that we published. I wouldn't say that we ignore it. I'm just saying that let's say we delay the implementation of autocorrelation until the hydrological parameters have been estimated. So it's still coming in through the error model. So when you do the error model, you have autoregressive or whatever you want there. But it's just that for the purposes of parameter estimation, at least for the classes of models that we looked at, we found that doing everything at the same time was creating these interactions between the autoregressive coefficient and some of the hydrological parameters. And we couldn't quite get rid of it. We tried quite a few different things, And I was a bit surprised that some of them didn't work, but that's where we got left. But I agree with you that from a more sort of, let's say, theoretical, in terms of theoretical elegance, what we're doing there is a little bit, a bit nasty, let's say. Again, just a pragmatic choice that we currently follow until a better, more theoretically appealing approach is available.
Actually, my statement is very practical. I mean it and you can check it by cross-validation or something like that, or bootstrapping or whatever which you choose.
And the point is that autocorrelation is built into the error model. It's just not activated when you calibrate the hydrological parameters. So when you calculate your predictive distributions of streamflow, you will have your autocorrelation there, and it will be quite strong. And you have all that. It's just that when you estimate the hydrological parameters, they themselves are estimated ignoring autocorrelation. So that it's not ignoring it entirely, it's ignoring it in the parameters, but keeping it in the predictions.
Well, no, but I understood that, but my point was precisely that the parameters are affected. Again, this is true, and I would say it's a universal truth for groundwater models where the structural error component, which is strongly autocorrelated, is very significant.
Yeah.
So maybe for surface water, it's not so severe, this effect.
Yeah, I want to say that this recommendation in particular is based on the particular class of models that we looked at. I'm absolutely not claiming that it should be always done this way. I just think that based on our empirical findings, for the particular class of models that we looked at, inferring everything at the same time was problematic. There might be some ways around it, and I think that these problems reflect that perhaps we're oversimplifying things elsewhere in the modeling chain. I think that I'd prefer to be able to have that in there, but just for the moment, we haven't been able to do that, make it work, let's say. But yeah, good point. I mean, I got a whole presentation, so I'm happy to give it next time if you want to. I'm surprised you don't have questions on the decomposition of errors, because that's very controversial.
Well, I already expressed my dissent on that.
Yeah. All right. The independence of the errors, but well, the errors in the rainfall data probably are independent from the errors in the streamflow data, because they're collected with different observation mechanisms. I mean, the rain gauge and the stream gauge, they're not going to be correlated themselves. But for the model,
but the problem is not data errors. The big problem is the structural errors.
Yes, the structural errors, there will be correlation there, of course.
Yeah. And in fact, again, here I think we are worse off than you are. There is this very famous paper by one of the leading groundwater persons. This is a 30 years old paper, by John Bredehoft, who was called, I think the title of the paper was something like Conceptual Model, surprise, saying that the conceptual model that you, after you do the calibration, etc., you always find out that the initial conceptual model was wrong. I think you guys don't suffer that so much.
We suffer definitely also.
So, but that's why I say that in our case, structural errors are terrible. Is what kills us really.
Well, the structural errors are, I mean, they're also very large in surface and conceptual models also. I think, yeah, I don't think they're smaller in surface models. But again, how to describe them is very difficult, because generally speaking, I would say, maybe this is a bit overgeneralizing, but statistics generally assumes that the model, the errors are in the data rather than the model. I think you have to do some trickery to represent, structural errors. For example, time varying parameters or model ensembles is one option, but none of them have been somehow entirely satisfying, let's say.
There is another thing I would like to highlight. This is not a question, but it is a comment for the audience, to highlight something that you said it, but it might have gone unnoticed.
Sure.
So let me, sorry, but just
Yeah.
Notice that this guy, this Dimitri, so I'm talking now to the rest of the audience. We suffer like dogs to compute uncertainty because we do a lot of linear analysis and uncertainty analysis and ensemble of models to predict the uncertainty intervals. This guy did nothing. He just did assume the error structure, which I loved. I liked very much that. And I did not know this. I thought that you did the same as we do, but I've learned it. I will read some of your papers just to find out the details because it is so much simpler and no less reliable, which is great. I love it. In our uncertainty analysis, we are always overconfident consistently because of this model structure error. But the way you do it is very honest and very robust. I really liked it. So,
Thanks.
But I just wanted to.
On having data available to calculate these errors, and perhaps in the subsurface space, maybe not so easy as we saw, in yesterday.
I'm not sure, but the point is, I will even change based on your presentation. I will change the way I teach this, or well, I no longer teach it, but when
So, and I'm sure that there are, everything looks good, at first, and then when you try to apply or in a new context, all sorts of things pop up. But I mean, I'd be very interested in seeing how this goes.
I wanted to make a last very general question for you to illustrate. I mean, I want to know your views. And actually, it has two sides. The side one is, well, the big uncertainty especially for seasonal predictions is rainfall. If it rains, you will have water. If it doesn't rain, you won't. So my frustration as a hydrologist, and now I am not being a groundwater person, I am being a hydrologist, is that we are not sufficiently married to the weather prediction people. So this is comment one. Comment two, and now I put my groundwater hat on. You guys ignore groundwater. And I say that both for the short term, but especially for the long term, the state of aquifers is essential. So please bullshit a little bit about those two comments.
Well, I don't think we ignore groundwater. I think that it's probably underrepresented in the model. But there are models that, in the conceptual model framework paradigm, let's say, the reservoirs can be interpreted in various ways. So you could interpret some of those reservoirs or some of those buckets as the groundwater storage. And some of the work that we've done with a colleague of mine from Switzerland, Fabrizio, is to look at, for different catchments, what kind of conceptual model structure would be most beneficial. In some catchments where we know that groundwater plays a role, we find that the conceptual model structure has to have some slow reservoirs to reflect those dynamics. Now, these are conceptual models, and I think many valid criticisms can be raised there. But there are model dynamics that, let's say, within those models that can reflect, at least try to reflect maybe some of those groundwater contributions. As you saw from my outline, I also had the flexible models. I think I probably did the right thing by concentrating on uncertainty, but flexible models, distributed model structures are a quite interesting topic also. I hope one day we might be able to discuss them. I also think that groundwater characteristics, let's say hydrogeological characteristics, do get reflected in conceptual models, at least partially, because again, the time constants in these models. But I will certainly buy that these models are very simple, and you have to be very careful when you start interpreting what happens there. Should there be more detail with the groundwater? May well be the case. Again, I guess something that has to be established in some empirical way to demonstrate that. And again, I'm sure that might be an interesting research work to look at how improve the representation of groundwater in these simple models. could be a very interesting topic.
And the rainfall?
The rainfall, what about it again?
Well, no, I feel guilty, and now I am not wearing a groundwater hat. Just that I feel guilty that we are not more closely working with the weather prediction people or with the climate. Yeah, well.
The interesting thing about the project from a logistic perspective was we were working together, let's say at least close, with the guys who were developing the numerical weather prediction models that are used for the rainfall forecasts. And so we kind of dabbled a little bit in that space. I mean, that's an entire, again, research topic, and they have their own bias corrections for their forecasts and downscaling. And I mean, if you just take the raw forecasts, they're pretty bad. And then there are all sorts of post-processing being done to them to improve them. And again, there are metrics for those performances. And I think that we did find that after using the improved rainfall forecasts, of course, the streamflow forecasting quality also improved. And metrics of reliability, precision, they apply to rainfall in the same conceptual senses and to streamflow. It's just that it's a lot noisier. So I wouldn't say that there is a total disconnect. Certainly, in operational agencies that have to integrate these products, they, at least at that time of that collaboration, there were discussions between the rainfall forecasting team and our streamflow forecasting team and other various other colleagues. So there are some connections there, but of course, maybe less than should be. So how's that for?
You want to say something? Okay. It's already more than an hour. I think it's okay to stop here.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation.